Hello and welcome back to the Countering Climate Skepticism podcast. Each week we tackle a different climate skeptic argument from different levels of the climate denial ziggurat. Our ziggurat is a stepped pyramid showing all the different levels of people that deny the existence of climate change. If you want to know more about that, we have a specific episode explaining what the ziggurat is in detail, although episode 1 is a good place to start too. My name is John Rainier and I'm joined by my co-host Mark Prosser. How are you doing, Mark?
I'm good, John. I feel a little bit guilty as I've decided that after my PhD, I'm going to fly to Japan. And that's not very good for the climate. I'm going to be straight with you.
No, definitely not. No.
So, I don't fly a lot. In fact, it's been in the past 13 years. I haven't flown. So
okay,
it's a bit of
really good. Yeah.
It's a bit of a departure for me. But in order to make up for it, I've decided that for the rest of my life, between March and September, so for the sunniest 6 months of the year, I am just going to have cold showers.
Okay. Oh, interesting.
So
wow, that's quite a commitment.
It is, but I still feel guilty about it.
Yeah. Well, it kind of fits in with what we're going to be talking about today, really, and I think that's going to overlap with us talking about the cognitive dissonance of trying to do your best, but knowing what you're doing isn't good enough. We plan to move on to the third level of the ziggurat this week, which is the idea that climate change is happening, it's us that's causing it, but that the consequences aren't going to be that bad. And we're going to get onto that next episode instead. We thought it might be a good point to have an episode on climate denial itself, actually looking at what climate denial is, why people believe that, and what type of people are denying climate change, and why, the many sources of it. Is it the fossil fuel industry? Are they the cause, the genesis of all climate change? Or are there other areas as well? It's a fascinating subject if it wasn't so consequential.
Yes.
So, Mark, do you want to start by explaining what climate denial and skepticism actually is?
Yeah. So, typically, climate skepticism or denial is when individuals or groups dispute what has become accepted science among the scientists that study these things. For example, we know that the Earth is warming and that humanity is responsible for that warming because of our emissions of greenhouse gases that trap heat, gases like CO2. So our podcast more generally, through the stepped pyramid ziggurat framework, goes into great detail about what is meant by climate skepticism and denial. I think it's fair to say in general that the term can be taken in a more narrow or a broad sense. The narrow sense is the one that I've just talked about, the flat denial of science. But there's a more general sense in which climate skepticism is defined by anyone arguing against pro-climate action to stop us moving in a positive direction of solving this problem. If we take this broader definition, then I think there's a bit of climate denial in all of us, if we're absolutely honest. For example, in order to mitigate climate change, we should be all flying a lot less and eating a lot less meat. Yet many of us, including me, as I've just admitted to, who are concerned with climate change, continue to do these things. So are we, on some level, in denial or skeptical? Just to be clear, I think the latter case of everyday climate denial and skepticism is far less problematic than the narrower sense when you're denying science. But I pointed out, as it is a facet of the way that we respond to the challenge that climate change presents us. Okay, so that's a bit of discussion about what we mean when we talk about climate skepticism. Like John says, for those that are interested, we have a whole ziggurat episode, I think it's the second one we ever did, where we provide a more specific idea of how to think about the different types that you find out there, rather than just broad and narrow.
Okay, so let's look at some of the causes of skepticism then, Mark. Why are some people skeptical of climate change?
Yeah, they are, aren't they? I think it's fair to say that there has been and still is a fair bit of climate skepticism out there. And it's really an interesting question as to why. Where the fuck does it all come from? So I'm going to posit today in this episode 3 broad sources of climate skepticism and denial. If any of listeners think that between John and myself we don't cover all the different sources, please do send us emails. We'd be really, really interested to hear other opinions on this. So to start off with, for the first reason, I think of it as the elephant in the room, the fossil fuel industry, coal, oil and gas. The modern world economy, as listeners may have heard, has been running predominantly on coal, oil and gas, and these are known as fossil fuels. The fossil fuel industry is therefore mind-bogglingly huge, and so are the enormous profits to be made. Climate change, unfortunately, necessitates that we move away from fossil fuels and get our energy elsewhere. This, from the point of view of the fossil fuel industry, is extremely troubling, existential even. And when faced with a choice between profits and a livable earth, they choose the former. Now, if for a minute I was to throw them a bone, a small bone, I guess that they would argue back, if we stopped digging for these fossil fuels, someone else would. And in the world we live in, they may well be right here. But on the other hand, this is where they then complain about governments being to blame by not tying their hands legislatively from stopping them doing this, but at the same time making damn well sure that the very same governments can't do this through their extensive lobbying efforts on those same governments. In any case, companies like ExxonMobil have decided that the fossil fuel production is going to continue, and alongside lobbying efforts to encourage governments to choose fossil fuels over renewables, have also been promoting an enormous climate denial campaign to muddy the waters.
Really? So we're actually seeing that they are funding a lot of the propaganda being put out there about climate denial.
Yeah, so there are a lot of think tanks that sort of operate in this space, and they get their funding from various dubious sources. Sometimes it's hidden, but sometimes you can trace it back. I think there's a book I'm going to mention a bit later by Naomi Oreskes, who talks about the sort of the whole industry of climate denial and how it's funded and this sort of thing. I'm not an expert on that, but it's very active and still is. So I talked about muddying the waters, but to give another example of this, when the scientists first raised the alarm bells about smoking causing cancer, the tobacco companies, of course, fought back. However, they quickly realised that they didn't have to win the argument. I.e., they didn't have to prove to the public that there was no cancer risk. All they had to do was to sow a little bit of doubt about the cigarette causing cancer claim to reduce the certainty of that link in the public's mind and in the smokers' minds. If they could manage that, then smokers would think, oh, well, all the experts seem to disagree, so I guess there's no point giving up just yet. And so it is with climate change. In fact, as I just mentioned, Naomi Oreskes' book, Merchant of Doubt, makes the case that it is the very same people and firms involved in muddying the waters on tobacco and climate change. They're the same.
Really? Oh,
yeah.
Wow.
It's infuriating. It's not as if this is all new. It's sort of tried and tested. So if they can sow enough doubt, then action on climate change gets delayed, fossil fuel production stays high, and the profits keep coming in. Good for them, not so good for the rest of us. I don't think anyone should be surprised by this. Time and time again, when it is discovered a certain industry is damaging public health and or the environment, they fight back in similar ways. In the 60s, it was realised that the lead content of petrol was harming people's health quite seriously, and the companies involved used the same sorts of tactics, muddying the waters on the science, delaying action on this, trying to influence politics to stick with the status quo that would be advantageous to them. If you're interested in delving deeper into this story in particular about leaded petrol and the efforts to get rid of it, to phase it out, please do check out a very nice dramatisation of it in episode 7 of Neil deGrasse Tyson's series Cosmos, A Space-Time Odyssey. We'll stick a link in the show notes. I think the fossil fuel industry, first and foremost, when I think of sources of climate denial and skepticism, because without them bankrolling with their huge funds the denial think tanks that muddy the water, climate denial would probably be far less prominent a feature of our modern day culture. However, I personally think that there's a little more to climate skepticism and denial than just fossil fuel interests. Any thoughts on that, John?
Yeah, so I was having a think on these, and I think a lot of the ideas I was coming up with was more of from a kind of psychological perspective, really. For one, like climate change is really difficult to see. So for individual people, the timescale, even though on a geological timescale it's very fast, for us as individuals, it's hard to see it happening, and it's hard to equate our personal experiences, what we see going around day to day, with the global scientific reality. So if you're not directly experiencing it, it's far easier for you to convince yourself that, well, maybe it's not actually happening.
Certainly.
And I think the other one is fear. Like, I mean, just hearing everything you've been talking about the fossil fuel industry, it's led me feeling really depressed and really feeling like I can't influence that or control that in any way. And I think that's a sense of what climate change can bring in a lot of ways. There's so much like doom and gloom as we talk about each episode, and we try and combat with our good news stories.
Yeah.
But also it tends to kind of try and shock people into making a change. But because of that, it's a very negative focus. So it kind of creates this sense that, it's the apocalypse, the world's ending, we're on the brink of despair and everything like that. And that's sometimes, for many people, they've got enough going on in their lives, and people just don't want to invite more of that into their lives. And so if you can't directly see it, why bring in something that's very negative into your life anyway? They've got their own personal challenges that everyone's trying to overcome.
I can sympathise with a lot of that, and I totally agree. It is a really unsexy subject, and the raft of negative emotions that accompany it is really unfortunate. And like anyone who's been put off or been depressed by the subject, I can understand that. So I have sympathy for these people. Yeah, absolutely. And like none of us are perfect, and that's something we'll talk about a bit later on in the episode as well. Like, so all of us, to some extent, even if we're doing our absolute best, we often feel really guilty. Like we feel like we're personally responsible for these terrible things that are happening to the whole planet. And it feels even worse as well if you feel that you can't directly change it. I mean, I got really depressed this week when reading this news story about the richest 1% account for more carbon emissions than the poorest 66% in the entire world. So there can also come along with it this sense of hopelessness, because there are people having so much bigger an impact that even if I am absolutely shit hot at making sure I recycle, then it is just a drop in the ocean when it comes to actually what needs to happen to combat climate change. And yes.
my wife, she's a cognitive behavior therapist, and she was also talking about this idea of cognitive dissonance. This idea that so that's a mental conflict that occurs when your beliefs don't line up with your actions, and it creates a really uncomfortable state of mind, having these contradictory values and attitudes or perspectives about something like climate change. And so in a lot of ways it's then just easier to just not have that dissonance or avoid that dissonance, sometimes not even consciously, by just not doing it, by just going, okay, well that can't be a thing then, so I'm going to deny the science that's there.
Yes, yeah, I hear you. I think when there's a tendency, and I think I'm a little bit guilty of it as well, to focus maybe on the individual things that we can do. For for climate change, like give up certain things like eating meat and flying.
Yeah.
I mean, while that's obviously important, I mean, obviously, we need to, as a society, we need to change. Governments, corporations, collectively. So the onus. I don't think the onus should be on individuals first and foremost. I think it's
and that's also something that I do see a trend of in politics as well. This idea that it's everyone's responsibility, so you go and do it. Can also be a way of just absolving bigger companies that are actually the ones that are going to make the significant difference from actually doing what needs to be done.
Yes, no, I agree with you there, and it's cynical basically, and they know it's cynical. So this is why first and foremost I I talk about the fossil fuel industry. It's not the only reason, but it's a big part of why we have climate change denial and skepticism. And to be honest, if they had dabbled less in politics, we might be further down the road, because we've known about this problem since we've known about it before the 90s, but in the 90s, we were certain enough that we needed to do something. So a lot of time has been wasted by heel dragging. So essentially, my eyes are focused on the fossil fuel industry, not individuals. So you talked a lot about sort of our individual psychology there. I have also been thinking about sort of individual psychological reasons why some people are maybe a bit more skeptical about climate change. And I once read a very persuasive article by a guy called Mike Berners-Lee, entitled "Climate Change. You almost couldn't design a problem that is a worse fit with our underlying psychology."
Okay.
It's a very catchy title. It starts off with the following quote. If you ever wanted to invent a problem to induce confusion, disbelief, and the turning of blind eyes, it would be hard to come up with something better than climate change. It's caused by a buildup of gases that we can't see, smell, or taste, and the effects play out through a weather and climatic system that is by its nature unpredictable and variable. This mix of abstraction, complexity, and long-term uncertainty provides the human mind with all the wiggle room it needs for avoiding or playing down the uncomfortable facts of the situation. And in some ways, we might be innately predisposed to doing just that. End quote.
Yeah.
Now, the article isn't long, but it contains point after interesting point as to why we humans struggle with climate change more generally. But of particular interest to this discussion is something called an optimism bias that we appear to have wired into us by evolution, although certainly hasn't been that excessively hardwired into me, I must admit. For example, we tend to underestimate the probability that we will experience negative outcomes. For example, no one thinks they're going to get divorced or get cancer, but we overestimate positive outcomes, like living till the age of 90 or winning the lottery. So when it comes to an unpleasant subject like climate change, we tend to sort of disbelieve it on some level. I mean, can it really be that bad? Won't it just sort itself out like the ozone problem a while back and other environmental problems the way they did? In another quote from the essay, Berners-Lee says, this sunny outlook may help us to, so he's talking about the optimism bias, may help us to lower stress levels and improve physical health, Sharot and others argue, but it also makes us prone to sitting back and just hoping for the best when such a response doesn't make sense.
Mm.
So even without the fossil fuel industry, denial and skepticism may still persist.
Yeah.
I think I've mentioned this anecdote before on the podcast, but an old teacher of mine who I met up with for dinner once was skeptical about humans changing the climate because she thought we were way too small as a species to affect something as flaming big as the Earth.
Mm.
So once I realised this, I showed her the image, which I'll link in the show notes, which shows to scale how large the bundled up into a ball ocean and atmosphere was compared to the solid Earth. Now you'll have to see the image to know what I'm talking about, but the ocean and the atmosphere are a lot smaller than you might think if you bundle them into a ball.
Mm.
And I think this helped changed her perception somewhat. in any case, the notion that we are destabilizing our environment is perhaps a little bit unbelievable for many people, as well as being scary. And so I can understand why some people would rather not think about it or believe it to be true. So apart from sort of the fossil fuel industry and sort of individual psychological reasons, do you think there's anything else, John? Or
Yeah, I think, and this really seems to have become a case maybe in the last 5 years or so, but how people identify politically seems to have been built into the issue as well. So I think, particularly we see this like with Just Stop Oil and groups like that. It's become very much viewed as a leftist issue. People on the left, and especially pointing towards radical people on the left, are those that are pushing for this. And if you lean more politically right, it's seen as something that is either not as big a priority as it's given from those people on the left, or that it's something that is just completely just not what we need to be focusing on at all.
Yeah, that's put very succinctly. I completely agree. So politics, in my view, in the Western world in recent years has undergone a change from the traditional left-right politics of redistribution to the current, I guess, localist or nationalist versus globalist types of politics. It's all a bit confusing, to be honest, but it's fair to say that whatever the state of politics, it's a hell of a lot more polarized than it once was. Yeah. Like you were saying with Just Stop Oil, and how they are viewed. You either love them or hate them. It seems to be the way it is now. So this idea of a culture war, where two tribes attempt to pulverize each other in a never-ending war, where nuanced debate has no place. This is the reality of too much political discourse nowadays. I can't remember where I heard this discussion before, but the person was arguing that I, on this podcast or somewhere, that in the 50s, in the US in particular, people were a lot more heterogeneous politically. So for instance, on the issue of race, religion and economics, your viewpoints wouldn't always line up. It would be more of a sort of a mix and match. You could have someone who was economically left-wing, religious, and pro-civil rights. But equally, you could have someone on the right who was also religious and for civil rights. So the point is that these three separate identities didn't always line up along tribal lines. And you may often have agreed with someone on some things, but not on others. Unfortunately, this no longer seems to be the case much anymore. If you're on this side, you believe these things, and if you're on that side, you believe these things. There's a sort of conformity among the sides. If you're on this team,
and as I was hearing in particular when we were over in the States, like if you're not somebody who thinks exactly the way you should think on your side, then you are a rhino, as the Republicans would call them, a Republican in name only.
Oh, right. That's interesting. I've never heard of that.
Yeah, it's one of Trump's favourite phrases. Yeah.
God. Right. Okay. That's. Yeah. So that's so mean, isn't it? All the sort of moderate Republicans.
Oh yeah. I mean, like I read his Thanksgiving message that he gave, and it basically said Thanksgiving to all those bastards who were out to try and get me. And it's like, yeah, really in the spirit of Thanksgiving there. What a twat.
Yes. So anyway,
for any of our American listeners, twat is an insult.
Yes. Yeah. We this podcast. We'll extend our hand to sort of moderate Republicans. Of which some do still exist. I listen to a few of them. David Frum, for example, is who I consider a moderate Republican, but Trump is not moderate. I'm sorry. If you think he's moderate, then maybe check out your own epistemics. Right. So climate change too, unfortunately, has become part of this tribal culture war, particularly in America. If you are religious, right-wing, and dubious about social justice, then chances are you are also likely to be skeptical about climate change. If you are economically left-wing, non-religious, and pro-social justice, then chances are you accept the science of climate change. Why is this? Well, I guess as people, we like to think that a lot of our opinions, or all of our opinions, in fact, are carefully thought out by us. But the reality is that we often tend to inherit our beliefs and our opinions from the social groups in which we're embedded, our tribal elders, etc. If the people we trust are sceptical of climate, then so are we. If they're pro-action on climate, then we are too. And another good quote from the Mike Berners-Lee's essay argues that climate change tends to be used as a political football in the much older debate about whether capitalism is or isn't a force for good in the world. So quoting him again, and we'll put a link to the full essay in the show notes, quote, "It's convenient for people with a libertarian political perspective to see global warming as not being dangerous, as it avoids acknowledging the need for government regulation."
Right, yeah, of course.
And they don't want that. But also, climate change is an attractive concept for people who, for whatever reason, are excited by the idea of modern capitalism imploding or Mother Nature putting humans back in their place.
Yeah.
Never met anyone like that. Not. So, but that too is unhelpful, as it means that some individuals waxing lyrical about climate change do so with a hint of glee, or as part of a broader political narrative, not to mention frequent factual errors.
Yeah.
And this is true because climate change is serious, but you get some types who will actually exaggerate the risks as well. You know, I mean, the risks and impacts are big enough. You don't need to exaggerate them, but you get. I think there's a sort of a guy who's put out a book, and it just paints, an apocalyptic vision of what the near future is going to be like. And I think climate scientists disagree with it because it's just gone too far the other way. So it's serious enough. You don't need to exaggerate it, but some people do because it basically helps them argue that capitalism is bad, and so they're all for it. So when someone like that, talks about climate change like this and exaggerates it, this serves as further proof to those with the opposite instincts, causing them to become yet more entrenched in their positions. And so a debate which demands to be had with open-mindedness has been stifled by the polarization of attitudes and even more biased and selective interpretation of evidence on all sides, end quote. So rather than asking the question of why are some people skeptical about climate change, you might instead invert the question. Why are some people so invested in the concept of climate change? Sure, the science backs it up, largely, but is that the entire reason? I mean, if I give you 100 libertarians and 100 left-wingers, you'll find you can, for the most part, predict fairly accurately in advance what their opinions on climate change will be. I personally think it's worth reflecting on this because if you frame the whole thing as the right are bad people who are anti-science and the left are good people who are pro-science, then you're unlikely to be able to persuade those on the other side who are sceptical. And if the subject becomes too politically polarised like that, then one side will continue to block legislation on it and more crucial time is wasted.
Yeah.
And that's
rise above it. Rise above it.
Yeah, it's easier said than done, but because the culture war is so all pervasive that we all kind of get sucked into it, I think a little bit. But like you say, if you can rise above it. So essentially in the US, I think Biden managed to get through a package on climate change, but it was only touch and go, because Republicans tend to block things, action on climate change. Or the modern day Republican Party, at least. So this is to some extent reality in American politics, and not so much in European politics, but it's still an issue. So this comes back full circle to the fossil fuel industry, as such political deadlocks on climate action suits them just down to the ground. Yeah,
any kind of disagreement, feeds those who want nothing to happen.
Yeah. It's like the whole muddying the waters. So did you think I covered all the bases there, John, with those three reasons? But so to summarise, the fossil fuel industry, our individual psychology, and then more our sort of our group and tribal psychology. Do you
Yeah,
think
well,
anything else?
I,
Or
yeah, I just the one last point I've got to finish up with really kind of links in with that last point, but also kind of looks at things from a kind of historical sociological perspective as well.
Mhm.
And so I've been reading this book at the moment on early modern Europe. So it's called Early Modern Europe and Oxford History. It's one of my old university books I've finally got round to reading, and there's a chapter in there by Anthony Pagden, who kind of talks about how Europe has developed. And obviously so much of the industrialization of the world comes from the development of Europe in the early modern period and spreading, and I'm including the United States and Canada within that as well.
Yeah.
And so really climate change, the impacts of industrialization have really come from us, and that's why I feel like us in particular in England, as the progenitors of industrialization, really have a lot of responsibility to do something about this. And so this chapter in this book talks about where Europe gets that viewpoint, that cultural and moral viewpoint from, and you can really trace it right back to ancient Greek and ancient Roman traditions, as well as coming through our Christian belief system, which has dominated so much of European politics over the last 4 centuries. That our morals kind of come from this belief that part of being human is to harness nature for our own benefit. So I think sometimes some of the resistance that we see is that it's seen as being like anti what our identity is founded in, anti our kind of like cultural beliefs that we as humans are here to be able to harness the world around us and to bend it to our will and make it what is ours, and to some extent that really, really lies at the heart of the conflict between indigenous people in America and the Native Americans and the kind of the Western American nation as it was developing. So it really can be seen, I think, sometimes that anybody saying that no, we need to go back to nature, no, we need to undo the impacts of all of this progress and technology can be seen as being people making a stand against our very identity as humans.
That's extremely interesting, and I had never considered that as a possible reason why people object to the climate change and the issues that throws up. Yeah, the idea that nature is our servant in a kind of a way, and when you say, hang on a second, not quite, something is shaken, I guess, in people, and they have a hard time dealing with that.
Yeah, and but to put a more positive spin on it as well, like in the Bible, it's very clear that nature is there to serve man. It's a gift from God to help man. But the concept of stewardship is also a key part of the Bible as well, that we have a responsibility to take care of nature and the world around us.
Okay, well that gives us a way to sort of talk to certain people who might hold this sort of cultural idea. Yeah. So those are the 3 big reasons, or now 4, including John's extra cultural one that we've come up with. Like we say, if listeners want to email in other candidates, we'd be very happy to hear them. One of the main, just to summarise, I guess, one of the main reasons why we started this podcast was to educate members of the public about the science of climate change, why we know what we know, to kind of like inoculate them against climate misinformation or disinformation. So that's a very passive kind of thing, I guess. But if you want to actively go out there and persuade people, who might be skeptical about climate change, and you want to stand the absolute best chance possible of convincing or persuading them, you need to first identify why it is that they struggle with the idea in the first place. You need to get this really focused idea of that. Now, sometimes it will be impossible or impractical. You're not going to convince a dyed-in-the-wool denier that the climate is changing and that we're to blame and that we should do something about it. But there are many people out there who are skeptical, who are nevertheless persuadable if you clearly identify and speak to their specific underlying concerns. We are, at the end of the day, for better or worse, emotional creatures.
Cheers, Mark. That's a great point to end on there. Now we're going to talk about our good news story.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in fact, actually, for this week, we've got two good news stories. So I've dug deep. I found a local one. And when I say local, based in the UK, but then also Europe as well. And a crazy kind of like future science sci-fi one that caught my eye as well. So first of all, in the UK, abandoned coal mines are providing a surprisingly potent source of zero carbon energy, and not just in the UK, but across Europe as well. So an old coal mine has been providing an English town with green energy for the last 6 months. This project is started in the town of Gateshead, and what it does is it uses the warm water that has filled up the tunnels in the mine to heat hundreds of homes and businesses in the former coalfield community. So I was like, how on earth does this work? How can you heat homes just from water that's just been sat underground? But basically it shows real potential because it's the first large-scale network that, and I was completely unaware of this, we have apparently a sprawling warren of old mining tunnels that sit beneath around a quarter of homes in the entire country.
Ooh.
I mean, that just absolutely blows my mind that our mining network was that large. It's so basically there's an estimated 2 billion cubic meters of warm water in these mines, more than a quarter of the volume of Loch Ness itself. And so the geologists believe that these mine shafts hold one of the biggest underused sources of clean energy. So the way it works, basically the water as it collects in the mines, it gets warmer the deeper it goes.
Yeah.
So the temperatures can range from about 10 to 20 degrees, but if you are at a depth of a kilometre below ground in these mines, it can reach up to 40 degrees. So as a thermal source, it can be harnessed through drilling boreholes, which then bring that water back up to the surface. It's then using heat pumps and extractors, they compress the liquid, which increases the temperature, and then it gets distributed through heating networks. And then once it's been absorbed in surrounding buildings, the water then can be recirculated back into the mine system to be warmed again. So it's this self-contained, self-sustaining system as well. And one of the advantages is that the water heated by mines, it can be working all year round, so it's not affected seasonally. And it can also apparently be used to cool homes as well as to heat them as well. And another massive advantage as well is that those communities, particularly those in the UK that were hit particularly bad by the mining closures in the 1980s, it's going to be a real boost to the economies of those areas as well. So, and you know, all credit where it's due as well, because originally this idea originated in the Netherlands and in Spain. They've been running this system for a while, and we've now adopted it into the UK as well.
That's great. Yeah. Is it actually are steps? Do you know if steps are being taken to actually make this a reality for a lot of houses? You know, on top of coal mines.
I don't know. I don't know, to be honest. The article didn't go into that, but to be honest, it seems like something that is almost like too good an opportunity to miss. You know, when you've got something that is already there as an untapped resource, you know, it almost seems daft not to use it.
Yes, yeah, I agree. That's really cool. I never thought about coal mines having water sort of, because to get heat out of the ground you need to dig the holes first, but we've got this network already there. So yeah.
And our second good news story is like one of these kind of almost something lifted straight out of a science fiction book. So they are building a solar space farm that is going to orbit above the Earth and could be operational by 2035. So there's a technology firm based in Oxfordshire in the UK called Space Solar, who say that it could be a major contributor to our energy supply in the future. So it will be 2 kilometres long, solar panels in space, and it would then send that energy back to Earth in the same kind of way that mobile phone signals work. And it could, because obviously it's in space, the sunlight is 10 times stronger outside of Earth's atmosphere than it is when it hits the Earth. And it also has the advantage that it's not dictated by times of the day, so it can capture sunlight 24 hours a day. And so can produce significantly more renewable energy than terrestrial equivalents on the Earth could do. And then last October, the European Space Agency, called ESA, unveiled a plan for a solar farm that would float 36,000 kilometres above the Earth. And so all the innovations that have been done at the moment in reusable space launches have now made this something that's economically viable as well. So, you know, the advances that we're making in technology are really expanding our options for being able to move away from fossil fuels at a far quicker rate as well. Also, it uses half the land area of terrestrial solar farm. Oh, blooming heck. Solar farms. For some reason that's a tongue twister. And 1/10 of the area of offshore wind farms, while producing 13 times more renewable energy. And we've just currently invested £11 million. That's 12.7 million euros for research into solar-based power.
I don't know about you, John, but hearing those two stories in quick succession, I feel like, you know, we stand a fighting chance with this. You know, all these smart people,
absolutely, like
coming up with ideas left, right, and centre. You know, maybe we'll pull it out of the bag. You know,
yeah, and that combined with not making things worse. Now, I think that's the key thing. Like we harness our ability as humans to learn, develop, and improve, while at the same time not making it worse. Stopping doing the things that we know that are causing the problem in the first place.
Yes, yeah. It's while I'm always a bit skeptical about people who just think technology is going to save us.
Hang on, what? You're a skeptic?
No, the skeptic word itself is not a dirty word in the context of climate change.
No, in fact, actually, that's a very good point, because I was going to mention that earlier, in fact, that actually, you know, skepticism is healthy. And, you know, by its very nature, I'm sure you'd agree, that's what a scientist is. You know, they're skeptical of the science that currently exists, and therefore they're looking to find an experiment and find new ways to develop and improve and what we know and what we understand. And it's the same from my discipline as well in history. It's always good to be a skeptic, as long as you're not denying what is proven facts.
Exactly, and it's funnily enough, I don't think we've actually mentioned this in the podcast before, but the idea that they've claimed the mantra of skeptics when in fact they're denialists. You know, they've just co-opted the word. They are not really skeptics, because skeptics, you know, well, they will have good reasons for what they believe, but will change their mind if they are shown incontrovertible evidence. Yeah. So they're not skeptics, really. However, while saying that, you know, if general members of the public, like my old teacher, you know, it just sort of doesn't quite believe that, like, we can impact, you know, something as large as the Earth, and they're skeptical. That's fair enough, you know, in that use of the word. But yeah, so, and like you say, science is all about skepticism.
Okay, so that's it for this episode. Thank you for listening. You can find a link to all the materials we've referenced in this episode in our show notes. Although we said this last week, next episode, we actually plan to look at level 3 of the ziggurat. So that will be the idea that warming is happening, it is human caused, but the impact will be significant, and we'll be looking at disproving some of the arguments around that idea. And if you want to know more about the Countering Climate Skepticism podcast, check out our website at ccspod.podbean.com. Something that will really, really help us out at the moment. We've been getting a fair few reviews coming in, but particularly reviews, 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts will help us out massively. So if anybody's thinking of leaving us a review, please do that. You can give us 5-star reviews on Spotify and things like that. Really, really helps us out. We've been seeing our listener base expand over the last few weeks, so we'd like to say a personal hello not only to our listeners in the UK, but also those that are tuning in from America and Austria as well, and the Netherlands, and we seem to be a big hit in Germany as well. So Dankeschön to all of those over in Germany as well who are listening. Keep spreading the word. If you want to send us any feedback, suggestions for denial, skepticism, or contrarian arguments, or if you've got further questions about the things that we've talked about and you want to know more, then by all means drop us an email or contact us on social media. Okay, so that's it from me. It's goodbye from me, John Rainier.
And goodbye from me, Mark Prosser.
And just a final quote to leave you with today. This comes from, I think I'm pronouncing this correctly, Xiye Bastida, who is a Mexican indigenous climate activist from the Otomi people in Mexico. And she said, "A vibrant, fair and regenerative future is possible, not when thousands of people do climate justice activism perfectly, but when millions of ordinary people do the best they can."